interdisciplinary view of risk, applications for security, really looks at risk related to IT, engineering, computer science, business, and also even a little bit with science and even psychology and law. So I've basically looked at all these areas. And one of the things that I think is coming out is that the Internet of Things, the security of the Internet of Things is a little different from the security of information, of personal information. And that includes, as we are well aware, driverless cars. So, am I loud enough, or do I need this? Yes, okay, need this? Okay, so we're going to talk about when security impacts life, involving the public and risk decisions, designing for risk, which includes engineering standards, and a model for ethical risk. So we're going to start out with security risk policy. And the first is the idea of the trolley problem. And in this case, you remotely control what happens with the trolley. And the way it's going right now is it would run into a whole mess of people and kill them. If you don't do anything, that's what's going to happen. But if you switch the control, it's going to kill one person. Okay, so this is kind of a theoretical thing. And the question is, do you hit that control that goes ahead and changes the route of the trolley? And a lot of people don't feel comfortable with changing the control because they are actively involved in killing one person. But and so they feel more comfortable not acting and letting it go. And I think this is somewhat related to, shall we say, the driverless cars, because we don't like to think of what could happen, and so we may not even make the decisions of what to do when a driverless car is out of control. Should it be concerned with the car occupants, pedestrians, animals, bigger vehicles? What should it collide into? Smaller vehicles if it doesn't have that choice. So thinking about that is an issue. Other things we don't like to think about are issues with project management. And we can see here on the left side a picture of a critical path. And the critical path is basically if you are late one day, the whole schedule is late. And many of us who have worked on projects know exactly what happens when you are late. You start cutting things out. So products could be delivered late, or we could have poorer quality. We just have a few more bugs in the code, or it's missing some features, or it's missing some documentation. And this could result in a breach of contract or a breach of safety regulation, and I think we all remember what happened with Obamacare when it first came out. Basically because of poor quality software. So a missed schedule in software development can result in a series of lies and wrong decisions. And the solutions for that really includes comprehensive risk management, good communication, including to the customer, quality software development standards, and a code of conduct and ethical training. So shall we say, the theory that drives industry is really came out of Milton Friedman, who wrote in the New York Times on September 13, 1970. He wrote, "What does it mean to say that the corporate executive has a social responsibility in his capacity as a businessman? If this statement is not pure rhetoric, it must mean that he is to act in some way that is not in the interest of his employers. For example, that he is to refrain from increasing the price of production in order to contribute to the social objective of preventing inflation, even though a price increase would be in the best interest of the corporation, or that he is to make expenditures on reducing pollution beyond the amount that is in the best interest of the corporation, or that he is required by law in order to contribute to the social objective of improving the environment." or that, at the expense of corporate profits, he is to hire hardcore unemployed instead of a better qualified available workman to contribute to the social objective of reducing poverty. Well, this is basically the theory of most of business today, and it makes sense. I mean, you really can't argue with a lot of his logic here, and it really drives industry to consider risk from its own perspective. Edward Freeman is a more recent person who's been writing about such issues, and he wrote a book with two other authors called Managing for Stakeholders, Survival, Reputation, and Success. And he argues there's a very pragmatic reason to adopt a managing for stakeholders view. It's what any successful business really does. So even if the ideologues who insist that the only legitimate purpose of a business is to maximize shareholder value or maximize profits, the only way to do that is to create great products or services that customers want to buy. So he also thinks that managers should be responsible for the effects of their actions if they want their ventures to survive, and he talks about how 60 Minutes is very likely going to be showing up on your doorstep if you don't make some right decisions. And of course, then you can watch yourself on 60 Minutes. So he adds that in our relatively free and open society, the consequences of not negotiating with a broad range of stakeholders is that they use the political process to pressure governments to enact a set of rules that is not likely to be optimal for company interests. And any situation where a solution to a stakeholder problem is imposed by a government agency or the courts must be seen as a managerial failure. So DeGregario writes of a security code of ethics, but some of the first questions he asks is, who is more immoral? Is it ruthless malefactors profiting from a vulnerability, or vendors consistently releasing vulnerable code? And another question, is it foreign governments taking control of our mobile devices, or vendors who use patching to sell us upgrades to legally protect themselves? So effectively, it was interesting. He even talked about the ethics of research, for example, or the research of vulnerabilities. But some of the code of ethics for security that he came up with was respecting human rights, including our right to reject immoral actions, do no harm to human health, which also includes working carefully with trade secrets, avoid conflicts of interest related to the employment, vulnerabilities, and data security, obey the law, preserve confidentiality, and the doctrine of double effect and dual use, which basically is that if the primary use of software basically agrees to all of this, then the secondary any secondary purposes should also as well. So one of the things he said was confidentiality, right? So the UN in its Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development came out with its openness principle, which is a recommendation for privacy. And what they recommend is there should be a general policy of openness about developments, practices, and policies with respect to personal data. So that basically means, and we do see this, we see personal statements by companies saying what their policies related to privacy are. Means should be readily available of establishing the existence and nature of personal data. So what data are companies keeping on us? What kind of information are they keeping? And the main purposes of their use, how is it being used, as well as the identity and usual residence of the data controller. So as well as who is maintaining that and in what country is it residing. I think probably the only thing that needs to be improved on this is the data controllers needs an S on the end, if we've seen from Facebook recently.
So now we're going to go into when security impacts life, and becomes more important as we get into the Internet of Things with pacemakers and various medical devices, as well as driverless cars or cars that have quite a bit of intelligence connected to the Internet. So Taebi basically wrote that public controversy is an indicator of unresolved moral issues. And if we take a look at the news today, we can see some unresolved moral issues. They include school shootings, climate change, abortion versus choice, prejudice versus immigration. And the public really questions more the issues of the ethics of things as opposed to the statistics. So what risks are deemed acceptable and why, what will happen if the risk actually occurs. And I live in the Racine area, and right now Foxconn is coming in, and so those questions are being raised as to what's going to happen with our water. The public is more interested in the moral aspects of questions and not the actual risk level. They're not as concerned with statistics, and they rebel when risk assessments ignore ethical questions. So Peter Sandman works with science. Okay, so he worked a lot with science and communications with the public. And you may recognize the annual loss expectancy equals the impact times the likelihood. It is the one equation that is best known in security. What you're not used to is the multiplier outrage that's at the end of that. But Peter Sandman came out with the outrage multiplier. So impact is the cost of an event occurring, and the likelihood is the probability. Now, what he really came up with is the table on the right-hand side. And if we think about data security, we can say that data security is really coerced and industrial. Well, that's interesting. Okay, it's deciding that's not. Okay, so it's on the right-hand side. Data security is really coerced. It's certainly not voluntary or natural. And then it tends to be, though, familiar and not memorable because we're all aware of phishing attacks, and we know that when we click on links, we're likely think links that we're not supposed to, or open attachments in email, that we're taking a risk. So it really isn't dreaded. It's a pain in the rear, but it's not dreaded. It tends to be more chronic, which is on the left-hand side, considered safe. It's knowable and individually controlled. When we do get hacked, when we do have a virus, it's going to be, we know it's our fault. It tends to be morally relevant. We're angry, people who did this to us, but it's fair, okay, because everyone gets hit. So it really is a result of untrustworthy sources, but it is more of a responsive process. So we could say that mostly data security is under the safe side with a few things on the risky side. But now let me give you another scenario. Let's say you just drove off the lot with a new car, and somewhere along the line in your first month, you are driving down the highway, and some kids go by with a laptop in their car, and they're smiling at you, and pretty soon you're lost control of your car. The car is starting to swerve across lanes of the highway, and then it does some strange things with the brakes, and then finally they dump you off into the ditch. Okay, now did anyone, when I first thought of this, I felt some dread in the bottom of my stomach that this could possibly happen, and I'm thinking about buying a new car. So effectively, this really falls into the dreaded category, into the risky. It's also certainly coerced. It would be exotic, memorable. It would be catastrophic, potentially, to your car and to your life. It would be unknowable, controlled by others, certainly controlled by others. It would be morally relevant and unfair. it would be untrustworthy sources and unresponsive process. So basically, this would be totally in the risky category, and at that point, we would add the outrage factor, and I will show you later on how that outrage factor actually goes into play. Okay, well, if your life starts getting impacted by things like driverless car, Internet of Things with health effects, Con basically has worked with the value of life. And, when you're starting with risk, you always have some form of an asset loss. And how do you give life an asset value? So generally, lower values are taken, and lower values are taken looking at how much money you're going to make from this point on. So those of us who are older, we would be worth less money than those of us in the audience, not myself included, who are younger. Okay, so younger people would actually be worth more. And higher values for the value of life have been researched and basically when people demand more pay for risky jobs, like, you're going to be a construction person, are you going to work on this house right here, or are you going to work on a skyscraper 50, stories high? Well, at that point, the difference in the pay can be extrapolated for people to estimate how much their life is worth. And the studies on the value of life in 1984 dollars, the high end was $8 million when you extrapolate from more dangerous jobs. $8 million in 1984 is $18 to $26 million today. So one of the big points here, though, is very often $2 million is used today for lower values. It's easy to underestimate the cost of others' lives when your life is not impacted. So let's take a look at the case of school shootings. This basically is a risk table for school shootings, showing, for example, loss of tuition, lawsuits. If you can see some of this at the very bottom is Virginia Tech University, which was one of the largest shootings that happened in the United States. So there's cleanup renovations, security costs, and then the VTU total, including everything. And then the lawsuits total is based on Virginia Tech as well. The single loss, it looks pretty large, but when you get to the annual rate of occurrence, the probability goes way, 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 way down. Okay, it just doesn't happen that frequently over the last 20 or more years. So effectively, the annual loss expectancy multiplying the SLE times the ARO really totals about $1,000. University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, or Madison, or University of Wisconsin Parkside should be spending less than $1,000 on security for its students if you took risk. If you just did quantitative risk analysis. Now, fortunately, the university is spending more than that, but effectively now you're starting to see where that outrage multiplier really comes into effect. Okay, involving the public in risk decisions, maybe the public isn't such a bad decider in some cases. So Johnson wrote that the public may be biased based on their own emotions. And the media may also be biased based on their own emotions, and the media is going to advertise, their own emotions, basically through TV, and very often people tend to see ethical things as black and white. We don't see risk as gray. Okay, so effectively, the public may be better at morally weighing types of harm, but the risk experts tend to have a more realistic view of risk that considers likelihood, and they see more shades of gray. So a combination of public and domain experts may reach the best decision. So another idea is that people can't think of risks that they haven't already seen. It's very difficult, for us to imagine, oh, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, it hasn't happened before. It's not likely to happen again. And so my guess is that, for example, Miami has been having problems with climate change so far, with water rising, and New York has not. And so Miami is probably more concerned with it than, although New York has seen a little bit, they haven't seen what Miami's seen. And so broad framing is a technique to consider worst case scenarios, things that might actually happen. When you have purchase controls, you often don't bring your risk down to zero, okay? There's something called the residual risk, and the idea of a vision zero principle is that there is no residual risk, okay? So there is no risk of death or severe harm, and that's obviously preferable to a residual risk. So the people who decide risk often only experience a reputational hazard when they make the wrong decisions. Only the reputation is impacted. And so Bodhi says that we should consider the interests of our fellow human as equal to our own. And one way to do that is to have the decision maker have a stake in the game. And maybe they drive around in that driverless car for a little while. But what happened in the U.S. Army 82nd Airborne Division is that riggers who packed the parachutes, they couldn't pick which parachute they jumped out of the plane with. It was randomly assigned to them, and that made them very careful. Now, it's very difficult to force that on risk decision makers, and so this Bodhi basically suggesting having a speaker for the absent within a software development team. Okay, now we're going to look at designing for risk engineering standards. And traditional software, very often, I actually teach some security, and students are very likely, when you talk about risk, they think about things like encryption, authentication, logins, passwords, access control, hashing, and defending against various attacks like SQL attack and replay and bad input. They can very often think of that, but they often don't look at the particular application. And the case study we do relates to a medical application. So if we think of medical identity theft, people could walk into a doctor's office saying that they're you, and they could have a host of different diseases that you have that now clutter your medical record. And things like that should be considered. What happens if you walk into a doctor's office and the computer system is down, and the doctor is asking you, I'd like to give you a prescription, but I need to know what prescriptions you have, because they don't have access to your medical records anymore. The system is down. So do you know if you're on, what prescriptions you're on? Are they pink pills or white pills, and how big are those pills? What dosage are they? Okay, now obviously this could lead to malpractice. Not to mention there's less IT staff. Okay, so there's not security people who understand security types of issues when they happen with a computer. And then they have to deal with HIPAA, both the privacy and security rule. So basically, software engineering is a complex social environment of clients, users, customers, business, and the law. And programmers or engineers need to be concerned not only with the software, but also with the application and what's going on with that. They have to understand the full application. If you've taken a look at law, HIPAA is actually pretty impressive. PCI DSS is pretty impressive. They're pretty technical. You know what you need to do with those regulations. But there's other regulations that really are not very descriptive. and they're not very technical, and you don't exactly know what to do. And in some cases where the law isn't there, but there's potential lawsuits. So Mittrakas suggest doing a soft law kind of thing, and a soft law addresses how you achieve due care when it comes to lawsuits. It's basically implementing a voluntary framework by industry groups, and there are some that already exist. Building security and maturity model, software assurance maturity model, and safe code are different industry groups that have gotten together to define what good safe code is. Gotterbarn has designed basically ethical line drawings, and we can see on the right-hand side that the lines are basically, dangerous on one side and safe on the other, and unethical and ethical on the other side. And so effectively, when we fly, most of us do not worry, at least I don't. I don't worry too much about the plane exploding or getting hit or anything like that. And that is basically because of airport security, including the X-ray checks. However, most of us don't like standing in one of those X-ray boxes. We tend to think of that as, standing nude in front of something, and so we feel highly exposed. And also, I know at least I worry about going through that too often because it's like an X-ray every time. So basically, what Gotterbarn suggested is putting arrows on that line, on those lines, indicating, what's good about some things and what's bad about some things, and then taking the bad things and sliding them over, okay, by finding ways of fixing those problems. And so in the case of personal privacy, what they've done is they've created all sorts of laws. I think in some, for whoever's observing them, there's various protections for you, including, I think, in some cases that it might be blurred out. In the case of affecting health, there's a bypass thing, right? So if you fly enough, you can ask to be on the pass zone where you don't need to go through that. Okay, if we look at the International Standards Organization designing automobile safety, it's kind of interesting to see how they design security from a professional perspective. And the first thing they have is the automated safety integrity levels, which really is a focus on risk and how risk, what is risky when driving cars around, and so that's really risk. And then the safety goals are goals on how to achieve, to protect against the ASILs. Okay, so safety goals are kind of very high-level goals and how to achieve that. And then that is implemented into functional safety requirements, which are not technical, but are mechanisms, measures, and behaviors to be implemented in the system. And then technical safety requirements actually design the technical implementation. So now we'll take a look at maturity model for ethical risk. And on the right-hand side, we could say that at the first level is risk immature, and then self-protection. If we go back to Friedman, it's the organization protecting itself, and then there's a compliance concern, which is being concerned about, regulation. And then we get into more of the Freeman, the second guy, and he was concerned more about stakeholders and society in general. But we have to recognize that there are a number of issues, which means that people can't implement things entirely. First, some organizations are profit-driven as opposed to trying to perform a common good. But there's also financial constraints. So in some cases, protecting students in schools, for example, may include being able to lock doors from the inside, but that's $200 per door. and that money may not be there. So the financial constraint may restrict social concerns. There may be a lack of customer interest in the sense that you may be willing to sell a product that is extremely safe, and maybe customers just aren't buying it. And then finally, we do not all make optimal decisions. So how can we expect companies to make optimal decisions when we ourselves don't necessarily do everything we're supposed to do from an optimal perspective? So this shows at the very bottom, we have Friedman, who's kind of on in the self-protection area, although that's really where industry is, according to some of the psychological tests in general. Most businesses are there, although Friedman did talk about compliance, so he might actually be a little more to the right of there. And then Freeman's to the far right. That's in the stakeholder concern area. But if we look at where at the ethics that psychology have come up with, and I'll just go over the three different levels. Piaget and Kohlberg really talked about pre-conventional morality, which is where students, kids, the first thing they do is they're going to obey. Oh, they're going to obey mommy, kind of deal. They do things because if they don't do things this way, mommy's going to get angry at them. And so that really is respect for authority and rules and respect for power and punishment. The next one level is cooperation and mutual respect and social values and rules. And that's basically society expects certain things, and so you're going to follow what society says. But also, you can negotiate. So the kids might say, can I go to that party? I promise I won't drink anything. And I'll mow the lawn if you let me go. So in the autonomous level, which is also known as a post-conventional, is getting into justice and welfare and reciprocality and equality. So, well, how can you tell, basically, or how can you mature where you are? Self-protection is primarily concerned, we're just talking about risk for our organization. But you can have more of a stakeholder concern if you're concerned about the protection of your customers and users, and that often happens with privacy. So effectively, we have a concern for the privacy of our customers. We're going to do such and such, and that often happens through policy. So the precautionary principle is from science, and it's probably the summit of ethical risk. It topped the charts on everything, and according to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, they said, where there are threats of serious or irreversible environmental damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing measures to prevent environmental degradation. And basically, the steps are to apply the principle only to plausibly unacceptable hazards, analyze risk scientifically, and establish a rational level of acceptable risk. So they really talk about pre-damage and post-damage, and so pre-damage is controlling any real damage before it occurs, whereas post-damage is cleaning up after it occurs. And another thing they're concerned with is intra- and intergenerational equity, development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the abilities of future generations to meet their needs. Okay, so that gets to our conclusion. One of the things you can see on the right-hand side is a table that for the United States, the number of records breached is double that of the population for the year 2016. Okay, so on average, every person had their record breached twice in 2016. And if you can think about personal security, organizational security, and global security. or national security and global security. And my own opinion is that having, on average, 2 records breached in 1 year is not adequate, and that may be due to lack of engineering, or it could be due to lack of financial or other types of concern. So there is a benefit to looking just beyond the organization, looking at security just beyond the organization. Obviously, you can lower your own threat of risk. There's fewer lawsuits and regulatory issues, but it may lead to more products, to more diverse products, some of them that are more concerned about security, or it might lead to higher sales if you tend to sell a product that is safer. And certainly cars, some auto manufacturers in the car industry know this. There's the public's outrage factor, which is not going to be as much a concern for you. And certainly, potentially, when you're just looking at risk from your own company's perspective, you may not see what is fully possible. But coordinating an effort in solving risk problems with other organizations may accomplish that. So that is my conclusion.